I believed I was enduring bullying from my mother-in-law, Pamela, but according to my husband, Steve, it was all in my head. Steve insisted that Pamela was merely educating me on how to be a proper daughter-in-law, asserting that I was skilled at playing the victim. When I confided in Steve about Pamela's actions, such as throwing my meals in the trash and deliberately dropping my laundry, he dismissed it as her way of educating me. To him, it seemed like a lesson in becoming a better daughter-in-law. I stood there, speechless, as Steve mockingly laughed at my perceived inability to see the educational value in Pamela's actions. My name is Laura, I'm 28, and I work as an office worker at a pharmaceutical company. Steve and I got married 3 years ago after meeting in college. Unfortunately, I lost my parents around the same time I graduated. As an only child, I felt destined for a lifetime of solitude. Steve, out of pity, introduced me to his parents, who initially welcomed me like their own daughter. After my parents' passing, I started living with Pamela in my in-laws' house. Initially, things were fine, and I enjoyed the warmth of my new family. However, after 3 years and facing difficulties conceiving, Pamela's attitude towards me drastically changed. Pamela would constantly remind me that, being the youngest in the house, I should take on the weekend housework responsibilities. Despite actively participating in household chores, Pamela seemed to harbor a growing dislike for me. She intentionally dirtied my freshly laundered clothes and made me redo the dishes. Additionally, she constantly nagged me about not providing grandchildren. Feeling broken inside, I confided in Steve about Pamela's behavior, hoping for understanding and support. However, Steve dismissed my concerns, attributing them to my imagination and overthinking. Despite Pamela never displaying her harassment in front of Steve, his refusal to acknowledge the issue made the situation even more unbearable. I found Steve's attitude towards the matter completely unacceptable. It felt like a twisted reality where Pamela was cast as the victim, and I, the supposed villain. This realization dawned upon me, leaving me with the stark understanding that I had no allies within the confines of my in-laws' house. Steve's disbelief in my claims only seemed to embolden Pamela, escalating her harassment from covert actions behind Steve's back to overt verbal abuse and mistreatment, even in his presence. During this tumultuous period, I discovered I was pregnant. Despite overcoming the challenges of morning sickness and entering a more stable phase, my heart remained heavy. Going on maternity leave only intensified the relentless harassment from Pamela. And Steve's refusal to acknowledge my struggles, coupled with his participation in belittling me alongside his mother, further deepened my distress. Even the joy that Steve initially expressed about our pregnancy gave way to him echoing Pamela's derogatory comments, labeling me as a woman who does nothing but eat and sleep. Knowing the detrimental impact of stress on the baby, I felt trapped with no apparent solution. In my desperation, the only person I could turn to for help was Steve. Determined to address the mistreatment and hoping for a change in Steve's attitude for the sake of our unborn child, I mustered the courage to have a serious conversation. Choosing a weekend, I approached Steve, who was casually relaxing in the living room. "Hey, there's something I want to talk about," I began, my voice laden with the weight of my experiences. As Steve lazily lifted his face from his mobile phone, I laid bare the cruelty I had endured from both him and Pamela. I implored him to stop ignoring the harassment and to consider the toll it was taking on me. Steve, seemingly torn between listening and indifference, stared blankly into the distance. When he finally refocused on me, his response was mocking and dismissive. "That's just you overreacting. What mom does isn't harassment or anything. Maybe mom is just trying to educate you to be a proper daughter-in-law. Why can't you understand that?" His words blurred my vision as disbelief and dizziness washed over me. As I unconsciously placed my hand on my stomach, a wave of realization washed over me. Looking down, I knew there was no way I could raise a child in the toxic environment of my in-laws' house. The mindsets of both Steve and Pamela would undoubtedly have a detrimental influence on the child. While their dynamics might seem normal to them, it was an unbearable struggle for me. My hand trembled slightly on my stomach, and an anguished cry echoed within me. But it seemed to fall on deaf ears as Steve responded with mocking laughter, pushing me to my breaking point. Expressing my concern, I said, "There's no way I can raise a child in this awful in-laws house. Your mindset and Pamela's will definitely have a bad influence on the child. It's hard for me, and I'm at my limit." Steve's unexpected suggestion to leave momentarily stopped my thoughts, but I quickly exclaimed, supporting my belly, "What are you saying? I'm pregnant." Steve, indifferent to the news, looked at me with a dry laugh, suggesting that I had nowhere to go if kicked out. His mocking voice echoed in my ears, fueling my anger. Overwhelmed by my intense gaze, Steve looked slightly displeased. In response to his laughter, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I pulled out a large Boston bag from the closet and began packing clothes and valuables. Steve seemed to believe that even if I claimed to leave out of stubbornness, I'd ultimately have no choice but to return to his parents' house. Pamela, hearing the conversation, added her perspective, stating, "It's your fault for not following our house's rules." With no intention of ever returning to my in-laws' house, I asserted my decision to leave. Once I settled down after leaving, I planned to send divorce papers, and muttered to Steve and Pamela, who continued to laugh unpleasantly. With that, I had made up my mind to raise this child on my own, ensuring they would never see the face of my unborn child. A year had passed since I made the difficult decision to leave the in-laws' house. Successfully navigating single parenthood, I gave birth to a girl and embarked on the challenging journey of raising her alone. For the past 3 months, I hadn't returned to the in-laws' house, and I promptly sent divorce papers to Steve, seeking to sever ties. Although the divorce was processed without issue, my request for child support remained unfulfilled. Contemplating future negotiations with Steve, I realized the need to involve a lawyer. In an attempt to lift my sinking spirits, I looked up at a towering high-rise in front of me. A sign proclaiming "Model Room Open for Viewing" caught my eye, and I decided to explore the possibility of purchasing a condo before returning to work. The distance between my current residence and both my workplace and the nearest child care center posed inconveniences, prompting a desire to settle down in a more suitable location. Fortuitously, I possessed ample funds to secure a condo. After registering at the reception on the first floor, I was guided to a room on the top floor. Riding the elevator to the 50th floor, I was surprised to find that the person assigned to guide me was none other than Steve. His presence caught us both off guard, and his discomfort was evident. Despite his current job in a securities firm, I learned he had switched professions since our marriage. Despite the awkwardness, Steve proceeded to show me around the top floor. Although his words were gentle, his glances betrayed his curiosity about my unexpected presence. The room itself was impeccable, boasting an ideal environment for single parenting, close proximity to my workplace, an underground connection to a child care center, and luxurious amenities such as a courtyard park and a 24-hour supermarket. Despite the discomfort of our unexpected reunion, I decided that this apartment met all my criteria for a stable and convenient living situation. My decision surprised Steve, who seemed taken aback, but I came prepared to sign a contract immediately if I found a suitable place to call home. Steve hesitated, and to my surprise, he didn't bring out the contract, leaving me in suspense. As I was about to question him, Steve's lips quivered, and a mix of emotions played across his face. His expression wasn't angry or jealous. Instead, it seemed accusatory. There's no way a single mom going through a divorce can afford the top floor of a high-rise. Steve finally spoke, his tone filled with skepticism. He seemed to suspect that I had caught the attention of a wealthy individual or was involved in some dubious job. I took a step back as he closed in, denying any such assumptions. "No, I just sold my family home for more than I expected," I explained. After leaving my in-laws, I had moved back to my family home, which was in my name. The house, left to me by my deceased parents, was too large for me alone. Before the baby was born, someone expressed interest in buying it. However, I clarified that selling the family home alone wouldn't cover the cost of the top floor of a mansion. Steve's skepticism was justified, given the age and condition of the house. Despite its flaws, the buyer, a wealthy individual fascinated by my father's water garden hobby, offered 5 times the market value for the property. The buyer intended to have a gardener reshape the garden to his liking. I continued, explaining that the sale included a living allowance, and I could now afford to live in an apartment nearby without financial worries. Hearing my story, Steve's eyes briefly sparkled, and his attitude shifted. He humbly apologized for his earlier judgment. "I'm sorry about what happened. Can we start over?" Steve confidently extended his hand, seemingly sure I wouldn't refuse. However, I didn't take his offered hand, asserting my independence. "I can raise my child and live well without you. I have no desire to live with someone who looks down on others," I declared firmly. In that moment, Steve's face transformed into anger, and he glared at me. Unbeknownst to me, a colleague with the contract appeared behind Steve. Perhaps curious about our extended conversation, I glanced past Steve to greet the colleague who had joined us. However, Steve appeared oblivious, his focus unwavering. The colleague's face turned pale as Steve continued his derogatory remarks, asserting that a woman being rich was inherently wrong. Suppressing the colleague's attempt to intervene with a look, I'd addressed Steve directly. "Is that all you wanted to say? So you think you can look down on me now that you're rich? You were better off as a lifetime servant in your husband's house." I sighed, turning my attention to the employee standing frozen with a stack of contracts and documents. Expressing my reluctance to make a significant purchase from a company that employed someone with such demeaning views, Steve finally turned around. The employee, realizing he was being addressed, rushed over and profusely apologized, almost scattering the documents in his haste. Encouraged by his boss, Steve hesitantly joined in the apologies. "I'm so sorry. My subordinate was incredibly rude to you. Come on, you apologize too." Urged by his boss, Steve seemed to grasp that things were going badly. They apologized repeatedly, but at my command, I halted them. "I won't buy it anyway. I'm sorry. I'll look at other apartments," I stated, and their expressions turned to despair. Despite liking everything about the apartment, I refused to spend my money with a company employing people like them. Leaving them bowed, I exited the room without anyone seeing me off. Alone in the elevator, I didn't look back as I walked away, searching for another model apartment. Later, I learned through Pamela that Steve had not only lost the contract for the top floor of the high-rise, but also faced a pay cut and demotion due to his verbal abuse towards me. His subsequent resignation marked a challenging period, with Steve struggling to find another job while grappling with alcohol and gambling issues, all while Pamela took care of him. In a chance encounter at the supermarket, Pamela expressed her regrets, pleading for me to remarry Steve and come back. I responded promptly, advising her to leave the house if it was unbearable. Pamela's face fell in despair, and I felt a slight sense of relief. Choosing an apartment in a different building, I returned to work, putting my child in daycare. The money from selling my family home was more than enough to support my child, but my love for my job led me back to it. With a recent promotion, I now lead a fulfilling life, successfully juggling work and childcare.